All right, welcome back, Sebastian here. So, time for part 5 for my series ranking F1 qualifiers. Today, we'll be looking at drivers ranked 40th to 21st. So, not the all-time, best drivers from this time period, but still some pretty good drivers. Definitely drivers I think most people would consider to be, between average to, above average during their time in F1. So, starting right away with driver number 40, Giancarlo Fisichella, a bit of an interesting driver, very up and down. His quality rating, negative 0.019. And for Fisichella, it really felt like when he was driving in midfield cars, very, very quick driver, very quick qualifier. Even though qualified, Jensen Button during their time together as teammates, I believe that was 2001, I want to say that was, of course, very early in Button's career relative to Fisichella, but still. And, even his time at Force India, obviously, very memorably got that pole position, Force India's first ever pole position, in fact, the only pole position. At the 2009 Belgian Grand Prix. So, some pretty good years there, of course. Some other years at Renault, teaming up with Fernando Alonso, that didn't go so well, but still, Fisichella ranks number 40 on my list. All right, number 39, a driver who I was a bit surprised that they were this high, but it is Kazuki Nakajima, quality rating of negative 0.023. I think for Nakajima, really the reason why he ends up being quite a bit higher than I think many, myself included, would have predicted, is that he only had 2 years in F1, so again, very early in his career, very little experience, and his teammate would turn out to be, one of the, I would say, best qualifiers from this time period in Nico Rosberg. And so basically, based on how the model basically calculated this, was that if you had a really, really strong teammate, even if you didn't do so well yourself, if you had a really strong teammate, it did generally try to bring your score up a bit more. Now, of course, there's a little bit of muddying, like I've said before, with the fact that it was the refueling era, but still the fact that a driver who ranks 39th on my list only got 2 seasons is a bit of a surprise. Maybe suggests that, Nakajima should have gotten another shot, another year in 2010. But again, race results were very, very poor. So totally understandable why teams were kind of, scared away by that. All right, number 38, driver who I think a bit surprised that they're this low, but it's Juan Pablo Montoya, quality rating of negative 0.027. Of course, Montoya generally had a pretty fortunate career in terms of what kinds of cars he drove. He generally drove really quick cars for most of his career, whether that was at Williams or later those final couple of years at McLaren. But that being said, the model does not rate him that high. Feels like especially his stint at BMW, felt like there's a lot more pace, a lot of inconsistency there in terms of his qualifying performances. And then when he got to McLaren, definitely second best compared to Kimi Räikkönen. So a bit understandable why he would kind of lose marks there. If he had stayed in Formula One longer, who knows? Maybe his rating would have been better. But for Montoya, 38th on my list. Now, number 37, Heikki Kovalainen, a quality rating of negative 0.027. For Kovalainen, a bit similar to what I said about in my previous video with, PK Jr. and Van Dorn. A bit of a case of a driver being in the wrong place in the wrong time. Honestly, pretty solid rookie season. Out-qualified his teammate Giancarlo Fisichella. And then second, third seasons, of course, teaming up with Lewis Hamilton. Didn't go so well. But even when you compare Kovalainen's record in qualifying was actually closer to what Button would do compared to Hamilton, following in the following years after, Kovalainen left McLaren. After that, McLaren's reputation never really recovered, and then 3 years at Lotus Caterham, kind of puttering around at the back of the grid. Again, didn't do too awful there. Was pretty close in qualifying with Jarno Trulli. Qualified him the second year, and then again was quite a bit better than Petrov their 1 year together. But for Kovalainen, I think career could have been very, very different if his reputation hadn't been sunk so early. So interesting to see him end up this high on the list. All right, number 36 is Sergio Perez, quality rating of negative 0.034. Now, for Perez, always a driver who is generally seen as a better racer than qualifier, so not a big surprise to see him a little bit lower than some would expect. I think when I do this for the race results, race performance, he should be a bit higher. But for Perez, pretty interesting long career as well. Last couple of years against Verstappen, definitely really struggled over one lap. Again, Stroll, definitely the better of the two drivers there. Ocon, again, a bit in hit and miss. First season, Ocon's first full season F1 was the better driver, but then, Ocon was the better of the two their second year together. Hulkenberg, again, a little bit weaker than Hulkenberg during their time together, but wasn't by a whole lot. And earlier in his career, again, better than Kobayashi and very, very close in performance to Jenson Button, which was a bit surprising to me when I, was looking at that data. But still, for Perez, 36 is a pretty good spot on the list overall. Now, number 35, a driver who didn't do too many seasons during this time frame, and that is, of course, Heinz Harald Frentzen. Quality rating of negative 0.036. A couple driving for, teams all over the place kind of on the grid. Jordan, during their kind of downfall in the early 2000s, again, did a pretty good job there, but again, a little bit slower than Jarno Trulli, I think, overall. 2002, a kind of a waste of a season, only a partial season there. Driving for Arrows, teaming up with Bernoldi, again, did a pretty good job of beating him there. And then 2003's final year in F1, of course, teaming up with Nick Heidfeld and pretty close in qualifying there between the two of them. But again, taking his age into experience, again, pretty good results there. So he ends up 35th on the list, even though he's, obviously this was kind of past his peak and he's generally better known for what his driving in the 90s. All right, number 34 is Olivier Panis, quality rating of negative 0.052. Now, of course, this was Panis after his Canada 97 crash. And again, many people who watched live at the time generally say that he was never really the same after that crash. Again, results on paper in qualifying from the early 2000s aren't terrible. Generally, pretty closely matched with Jacques Villeneuve, but again, after that, going up against Cristiano de Mata, again, generally the better of the two drivers there, and that was kind of the end of his career. So for Panis, does end up a little bit higher, but still definitely 34th out of 125 drivers is definitely not a bad spot to be, especially towards the tail end of your career. All right, number 33 is Eddie Irvine, quality rating of negative 0.056. A bit of a surprise to see him ahead of Rubens Barrichello, given that when you compare results directly against Schumacher at Ferrari, I think Barrichello's results were generally a little bit better than Irvine's. So again, a bit of a surprise to see Irvine there, but again, a bit of a small sample size. Only did the 3 seasons, again, did have slightly weaker teammates. 2000 at Jordan up against, Johnny Herbert, who's also in the photo here. 2001 had Birdie and I believe Pedro de la Rosa's teammates, and I believe, again, that was the same lineup the following year in 2002. So we never really had great teammates during this time period, but still, even, kind of using data from the Irvine's data from the 90s to kind of like correct the data from the 2000s, it still had him up in 33rd. So I think before I put the data from the 90s in, it had Irvine way higher. So again, that's part of the reason why I did that before presenting the results. All right, number 32, Pierre Gasly, driver from the current grid, generally considered to be one of the stronger qualifiers in the midfield. Quality rating of negative 0.064, so pretty good results there. Doing a pretty good job this year, of course, against his teammates, Colapinto and Doohan. He's had a very, very good run. I'd say probably his best year in qualifying to the 2021. Of course, a bit of an unknown in his teammate at the time, Yuki Tsunoda, but, pretty good job there. Again, he's generally done a pretty good job in qualifying throughout his career, with the exception of the first half of 2019, of course, up against Max Verstappen. But really, I think for Gasly in 2019, it wasn't his qualifying results, I think, led to him getting demoted back to Toro Rosso. It was the race results. And the fact that he would just get stuck in traffic, get stuck behind slower cars. So for Gasly, pretty good qualifier. I think would be interesting to see what he could do in a front-running team again, but I do think because of those 2019 results, I do think teams are a little bit wary, and a lot of teams, I think, would rather go for the shiny new toy, and especially with so many good young drivers coming through this year. I think it's just going to make things even harder for Gasly in the coming years if he wants to get back to the front of the grid. All right, number 31, driver who's quite a bit of time overlap with Gasly, and that's Nico Hülkenberg. Quality rating of negative 0.072. And for Hülkenberg, a lot of the things I just said about Gasly being, one of the best drivers in the midfield really apply to Hülkenberg as well. He's been a great foot soldier for, such a long part of his career, with the exception, the one big difference between himself and Gasly is that he never really got a shot at a front-running team, was connected to Ferrari earlier in his career. I think if things had gone slightly differently, I think could have ended up in the Red Bull in 2021. But I think, realistically at his age now, probably not going to happen unless, Audi has an absolutely fantastic 2026 or 2027. But still really, really good qualifier. Again, not an elite qualifier. I think that 2019 season up against Ricciardo kind of showed that, again, he is lacking a little bit compared to the absolute best guys, but still doing a really good job. And even this year, I think this year we're starting to see those qualifying results slip a little bit. And again, up against a really, highly rated young teammate in Bortoletto who has not showed up on my list yet. Again, I think that age is kind of starting to show this year in qualifying. Okay, number 30 is Ralf Schumacher, quality rating of negative 0.086. For Schumacher, a bit of an interesting one. Drove some very, very good cars in the early 2000s in the Williams BMW, got some pole position, got some wins, but model, unfortunately, doesn't seem to rate him that highly. Of course, after his time at BMW, went over to Toyota, was generally second best to Jarno Trulli there, and again, Trulli hasn't shown up on this list either. But for Schumacher, 30th honestly isn't a bad spot, but maybe the fact that, both Schumacher and Montoya have shown up on my list already maybe suggests that Williams BMW was quite a car. And again, two drivers did, or maybe if they had a very, very highly rated driver, maybe if the Michael was driving the BMW Williams, would have been interesting to see what kind of results he could have gotten in that car. All right, number 29, Alex Albon. A bit of a surprise to see him this high. Definitely a bit of a surprise to see him ahead of Gasly and Hülkenberg, who are, contemporaries of his in terms of time when they were racing in F1. But for Albon, quality rating of negative 0.091. I think Albon's done a really good job for himself. Last 3-4 years, really done a really good job of rebuilding his career. After that, really tough year and a half at Red Bull early on. Even when you look at his quality numbers, his quality numbers against Verstappen relative to some of the other drivers who've come since, they're better than Perez's, but better than Tsunoda's. And then again, when you look at some of his teammates at Williams, I think he's done a really good job against Sainz this year. I think maybe there's a lot of head scratching going on about, why is the gap, what it is. I know it's Sainz's first year at Williams, whereas, Albon's been there for quite a few years. And I think next year we'll have a bit of a more accurate picture of that, of, the exact pace difference between the two of them. But again, I think, it shows Albon's done a really good job. And I think it would be really interesting to see what he could do in a front running seat. So again, a lot of what I said about Gasly also applies to Albon when it comes to that conversation. All right, number 28, a bit of a surprise to see this driver this high, but it is Paul di Resta, quality rating of negative 0.108. First season, out-qualified by Sutil. Second season, very, very close with Hülkenberg, and then third season, better than Sutil, of course, reunited his teammates after a year apart. And then I think for di Resta, really pretty short F1 career. I think he probably deserved to have a bit of a longer career. Did have a bit of a reputation for being hard to work with, which is part of the reason why I think he ended up without a seat after the end of 2013, but still for di Resta, the results, at least over one lap, were pretty good. And because he was relatively young, inexperienced during his time in F1 during this time period, the model does kind of end up rating him a little bit higher. And again, a little bit of a small sample size there as well, so maybe a little bit high for di Resta. All right, number 27, a lot of what I just said about di Resta being a little bit higher than I thought also applies to Sebastian Buemi. For Buemi, quality rating of negative 0.122, but I think for Buemi, it is a bit of an interesting career. 2009, of course, started the season with Sebastian Bourdais at a time where the Red Bull team, to drive for the Red Bull team, you had to be named Sebastian. Or so maybe if I was driving at the time, maybe I would have been a shoe-in for the Toro Rosso seat at the time. But, lame jokes aside, for Buemi, honestly, his gap in qualifying 2009 was honestly pretty comparable to Vettel's the year before against Bourdais. Obviously, different cars, refueling era, those same qualifiers can definitely be applied there. But then after that, generally the better qualifier between himself and Alguersuari would have been interesting to see what he could have done at a different team with a different teammate. But yeah, for Buemi, ends up 27th on the list. All right, number 26 is the first champion on the list, and it's Jenson Button. Quality rating of negative 0.126. And to be honest, if without even looking at the results, if you ask me which F1 champion during the time period 2020-2025 would show up last in terms of quality results. I think most people would have picked Jenson Button anyway. Had his struggles definitely in his first part of his career. I think before he got to BAR, out-qualified by Jarno Trulli, out-qualified by Fisichella, out-qualified by Ralf Schumacher those first 3 years. To be honest, a bit lucky that he got even a fourth year after being out-qualified 3 teammates in a row. And pretty good job at BIR up against Takuma Sato, but Sato showed up quite a few videos ago now. So again, not particularly highly rated teammate Sato. And then again, pretty close in one lap pace compared to Rubens Barrichello. Out-qualified by Hamilton by a bigger margin than Kovalainen at McLaren, and then of course pretty good results compared to Alonso, to be honest, and that honestly probably went to score up a bit. But for Button, again, he was never really known for being this absolutely an absolute monster over one lap pace, but very, very good racecraft, very good race pace, and that was kind of always his bread and butter. All right, number 25, Felipe Massa. We're kind of getting into drivers who, generally pretty highly rated overall. But for Massa, quality rating of negative 0.144. Generally pretty well regarded over one lap. Even, post-accident, he still had some pretty good years. 2013, very, very close in qualifying to Alonso. Even after that, Williams, again, bit of a hit and miss. Definitely second best compared to Bottas. And prior to his accident was pretty close in one lap pace to Raikkonen, which I think was a surprise to many. Had a bit of a gap there to Schumacher for sure, 2006, and before that, some of his teammates were a little bit not great. Villeneuve 2005 definitely comes to mind there. But for Massa, generally pretty good qualifier. Definitely not top class, not in the top 20, but still pretty good overall. All right, number 24. So this is Michael Schumacher part 2. So this is Schumacher from 2010 to 2012. And despite the fact that, he had this really severe neck injury in 2009, the motorbike crash, which is part of the reason why he didn't come in to replace Massa at Ferrari that year. And there was a really interesting article on the race, I think last year, or it might have been like 6 months ago or so, where I think I can't remember who wrote the article specifically, but it talked about how how serious Schumacher's crash was that year. And I think if someone who wasn't an F1 driver had that crash, it probably would have been fatal, and it left Schumacher just not able to feel the car, feel things the same way because of the nerve injuries, I believe. That he suffered from that neck injury. And so that's part of the reason why I've separated Schumacher's results into two parts. I know there's also a bit of a time gap there, but again, not that much, especially not as much compared to Kubica. But for Schumacher's time, his second stint in F1 at Mercedes, generally second best compared to Rosberg, but his results were improving year on year, and by the end, he was honestly not that far off in 2012. Would have been interesting to see what he could have done. I think if he had not had the 2009 crash, I think it would have been really interesting to see how he matched up against Rosberg, but unfortunately, that's the way things are. And again, even if it was left, I think a lot to be desired compared to his previous form, I think overall it was still not bad. All right, number 23 is Nick Heidfeld, quality rating of negative 0.166. Heidfeld, very, very solid driver for quite a few years. Very good results in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, even late 2000s, to be honest. Kept Robert Kubica honest over one lap during their time as teammates together. His results in the 2010s, not so good, but, very, very small sample size, and he came in very, very late to place Kubica after his accident, so again didn't have a ton of testing. Before his time in BMW, or at least his time with Kubica, again not quite as good as Mark Webber, 2005, and before that basically beat the tar out of Pantano in 2004, and then before that some pretty good results against Heinz-Harald Frentzen, John Alesi as well. All right, number 22 is David Coulthard, quality rating of negative 0.171. Now, for Coulthard, of course, this time period is kind of when, he's towards the end of his career. Definitely the quality results were not great. McLaren, again, either Hakkinen or Raikkonen was definitely second best over one lap. I think I believe with the exception of Raikkonen's first year, although I think Raikkonen might have actually qualified him there. And then, of course, time at Red Bull was pretty good. Generally was better than Clean. But, I think Webber kind of showed up. 2007 kind of showed, there was definitely a bit of a gap there in terms of one lap pace. And for overall, though, Coulthard is ranked 22nd. All right, number 21. A bit of a surprise to see this driver not in the top 20, but it is Daniel Ricciardo. Quality rating of negative 0.182. Now, for Ricciardo, he had some absolutely amazing years. 2014 comes to mind. And honestly, before that, 2012, 2013, very, very good years as well, from purely a qualifying perspective. He did have some off years, though. 2015, I think, probably should have had a bigger margin to Kvyat than he did. And then, of course, you can talk about, what happened at McLaren and after that. The years against Norris and then against even last year against Sonoda, not very good qualifying results. And again, if you were able to take those results away, his average rating for his whole career would be much, much higher, and he would be likely ranked easily in the top 20. But even taking age into account, Ricciardo just did not have a great time with these ground effect cars. So there you go. That is the end of part 5 of this 6-part series. One more part to go, and that is, of course, the top drivers. These are the all-time best drivers from this 25-year period, this past quarter century. So stay tuned for that. That'll be coming out in a couple of days' time. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.